Supply chains are complex, and securing your software supply chain is no exception. From the huge number of components and dependencies that you use from a wide variety of sources, to your developers adding their own code, to your applications being delivered to users around the world. How do you keep track of all this? At Aincor, we believe that managing and protecting your software supply chain starts with establishing trust. And that trust begins with understanding and managing your software bill of materials, or SBOM. SBOMs function as an ingredients label for software. And when you track and manage the ingredients, you can trust the components you use or bring into your development pipeline. It starts with verifying the provenance of open source code and validating supplier SBOMs, and keeping a repository of SBOMs to track the ingredients of your software over time. And maintaining trust as you build, with continuous automated security that uncovers vulnerabilities, malware, and leaked secrets, with compliance checks to root out any critical issues. Then, when you're ready to deliver your software, providing SBOMs and continuing to monitor for security risks after deployment, so your users can trust you and rest assured that the software you deliver was built securely every step of the way. To learn more about Aincor's software supply chain management solution, visit us at aincor.com.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We're just going to give it a minute. All our speakers have arrived. Wonderful. So welcome, everybody, to our webinar today. We are actually introducing a new open source project called Grant, which is made for license tracking and compliance. So a little housekeeping items before we get started. Everybody is muted today, so please keep that in mind. If you have questions, please use our chat panel. You can enter those, and then we can do either during the webinar session or afterwards a Q&A. And then we will always email the link with the recording out and the slides as well, so no worries about that. And if we have any polls coming up, which I don't think we have this time around, but please have a look at it, and then we can get those started, okay? So we have our speakers already here, and it's my pleasure to introduce both of them. We have Christopher Phillips, our senior software engineer here at Aincor, and then also Dan Nomi, our co-founder and CTO. So I'll hand it over to them, and they can go ahead and get us started with a short introduction and then kick us off. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. We're really excited to talk about Grant, and specifically some of the interesting problems that Grant is intended to solve. But first, I'll talk a little bit about Aincor itself. We have a number of different technologies, ranging from some great open source tools to products that actually use those open source tools as part of their functions. And fundamentally, what our tech stack does is it's intended to help people with a growing, very dynamic, large software surface area involved in how your applications are built, what's inside of them, understanding the dynamic nature of their dependencies, ranging from vendor dependencies to open source dependencies, how that stuff changes over time, to try to make it as frictionless and manageable as possible. And our technical principle here at Aincor really distinguishes the operation of looking at all of your software as it's flowing through your CI/CD systems, from source code all the way into Kubernetes or wherever your applications are running, and really understanding that material very well, and then building all sorts of higher level functions, security, scanning, policy enforcement, compliance enforcement, best practices enforcement, insights, making reports, things like that. And so we're going to be talking about a specific problem today. The agenda, we have some introductions, which we're doing now. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific problem that's the core of this particular webinar, which is around open source licenses and asks that software development shops get with regard to open source licenses, when those show up, when the requests happen, how complex they are, and what can we do to make it a little bit better. And then Chris, who is the author of Grant, is going to show you Grant, talk a little bit more about exactly what it does, why it exists, and actually give you an empirical example of Grant in action. And then we're going to conclude with some questions and answers. So to get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem, which kind of boils down to something we've seen as a software development shop ourselves, which is that our consumers, which is to say customers, users of both our OSS and our products, actually need more than just our product, right? And this is a trend that's been going on for the last 5+ years, where it used to be in the past, for the most part, you have some software, you ship it, and customers and users will use it. Now, with how complex these environments have become, your product actually has a lot of other products in it. And there's been a lot of supply chain security concerns and open source insights and all sorts of stuff going on that really has more to do with the components of your product than it does the product itself, in some sense, if you think of the product itself as the code that you write. And so Chris, who's going to be talking next, found this really incredible comic, which I thought we both thought would be a great way to start to describe the problem that we're going to be talking about. And this comic depicts a software developer, and that software developer sees something that's really interesting. They're starting to work on a problem. The context builds up in their head. They're thinking about it. It becomes more complex. It's really interesting. There's flow charts and diagrams, starting to figure out where this come from and what's going on. It's that zone that all software developers get into, which is like, this is interesting. It's meaty. It's a real challenge. Like, I'm into it. And then somebody arrives and says, hey, so I just sent you an email about that thing. And you can see in this comic, all of that state just gets sucked into a black hole from the distraction. And then the developer goes all the way back to the beginning again, rinse and repeat. So this comic, I thought, was really nice because it sort of describes a condition that, I think is familiar to a lot of us who build software. But it also lightly implies a few things, which is in that panel where somebody arrives and says, hey, here's an email about that thing. One of the implications is that it's kind of like a random interrupt, right? It happens whenever. And the other implication is you don't know what that thing is. It could be a different thing every time. However, there has been a specific thing that is definitely an interruption, but it happens all the time, right? It's something that comes up somewhat infrequently, but frequently enough at a deterministic point of our software development where it's something that we know is going to happen. And also, it's always the same thing, and it's a necessary thing. So it's not quite the sort of random interruption. This is one where it's like, hey, this happens a lot. Every time we ship software, a customer, a user requires, especially when they're a new customer, requires a description of all of our components and what open source licenses they have, and some other metadata about the components. Maybe they'll actually need a vulnerability scan or a description of our secure development practices. Those are all pieces of metadata that are required to deliver alongside the software. And in the case of the open source license request and the component breakdown, that's actually pretty complicated, right? It may have been in the past. You'd have a handful of open source license or open source software that are part of your dependencies. Now, even in our case, we have a handful of products. There are hundreds, in some cases thousands, of open source dependencies that are in use across all of our software deliverables, and generating that list on demand is actually pretty time consuming. This is a good problem to have, much like a scrambled Rubik's Cube. It's interesting. It's something that's sort of fun to try to solve, but it can be time consuming. It's also a good problem to have because it usually means you've got a new customer, you have a new user, somebody really wants to use your software and they need this other stuff. And so this is the combination of these two things is something that always happens. It's necessary. It's a good problem because it means we have a customer, a new user of our software. Really made us think, well, yes, this is something that we need to kind of solve because it is time consuming. And if we drill down and look at it a little bit more specifically, this is empirically realistic. Like we we didn't make this kind of situation up. This happens all of the time in our environment, where a new customer or a user will send along something that looks like this, along with a request, right? This is a spreadsheet. It says nothing except for a couple of columns. And the request is, please fill out this spreadsheet with every single component that's part of your application, its version, its open source license, some website details, what type of software it is, on and on. And so this is what you're faced with, and this is what you need to produce, right? Which is a fully fleshed out spreadsheet that's got all this information in it. Naively, you would think, well, we can start with some great stuff like an SBOM generator, which Anchor also has. It's called SIFT. That's another open source tool, which is at the core of our technical premise to generate some of this information. And then there's some more information, and it gets more complicated because, okay, let's say we've done this and we've filled out this spreadsheet and sent it as part of our contract or whatever. There's a little bit of an interesting piece of detail that lives usually alongside that question, which is for every software release. So now we have to think about, okay, well, that's version 1. At version 2, we have to do this again, because when you've got hundreds or thousands of open source dependencies or vendor dependencies, they change all the time. They do not coordinate in lockstep. These things change. Their licenses might change. Their versions certainly do. There are changes, and so you have to figure out an up-to-date version of this to go alongside.
Whoops, I think we lost Dan here. Chris, can you jump in maybe?
Yes, I can. I was actually just trying to see if it was my internet or Dan's internet.
No.
Okay. Yep. Nope. Okay. Thanks everyone for sticking through. But as Dan was kind of elaborating, you get to this next stage where version 3 and ad infinitum n number of times you have to keep delivering this list. And even a higher order problem than that is when you're delivering this per component. You have to jump into, let's say you're an architect for this microservices architecture, and you have to release that to a vendor that's being deployed on Kubernetes, right? Then what you're seeing as that goes over time is more and more components get stacked out. So as you go vertically, delivering n number of times to version 3, you're going horizontally for each service that's being tacked on. And that just keeps increasing the problem. And the more that you have to do that, the more you're stressing your software engineers. And then you have to kind of go back and do revisions. So Dan was nice enough to show the problem where when you move backwards to a version to release a bug patch, maybe a new software dependency has been brought in that is a new license, and that gets highlighted before you can deliver that bug patch. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dan. It looks like Santa Barbara did not drop off the face of the earth. So that's all that's good for us. So please, Dan, we got to where you're releasing the bug patch of v2.0.1, and you can go from there.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, all. Yep, network interruption. It looks like we're back. So yes, so the interesting one about this is, hey, version 201, right? This is it. Not only our newer versions, but we might have to go back in time and make a new version. Long story short, this is time consuming, right? We've got a pretty complex environment. We have to fill out these sheets all the time. And we kind of thought to ourselves, we have this problem ourselves in spades. We thought to ourselves, yeah, this seems pretty complicated, but it shouldn't be that complicated, right? There should be a better solution, because kind of back to that comic, this is an ask that always happens. It's always the same ask. We know a lot about software composition as a company that has SBOM generators and do a lot of work trying to figure out what is inside applications and to enumerate them in machine readable ways. And so we set out to actually try to solve this problem specifically. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk to you about Grant, which is the solution we have come up with. Chris has put a lot of time into developing and creating to hit this problem.
Nice. Yeah, thanks, Dan. If you are in the chat and you haven't joined, or you've joined less recently, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these links again so that they're available and you can kind of follow along from there. The first one is the actual program, Grant, and the second one is kind of a demo license report repo, which shows how you can use it with images in a GitHub Action workflow to to Dan's point, we used a spreadsheet because that's something that we've encountered with our customers, but it's important to note that Grant just has a -o JSON or -o CSV that if you're a solutions provider and you're coming into trying to make something that can generate this on demand on button click, you can take that data structure and turn it into whatever you want to see for your customers. And so that's actually a good segue into why we wanted to move away from either manually building this sheet or just taking the sheet from software bill of material. So one of the things is the repeatable work that has to persist over time is the artifact, right? The data structure, the SBOM for your software component. But what you end up doing is SIFT has no concept of license metadata, right? It has no concept of this is a specific license. If I analyze this text, I can 99% of the time declaratively say it's MIT or it's Apache 2.0. What you can do, though, is if you have the license content or if you have the actual license itself, or if you use Grant as a standalone and you have the source available, you can sick a library that's inside of Grant called the Google License Classifier to analyze any of those files and come up with an answer to say, oh, maybe it wasn't declared in the metadata, but I found MIT at this subsection of this package at this point. And I have this file that proves that it's MIT. One of the things we want to add further, we talk about roadmap, is declaring and finding kind of a diff between the official source of MIT and what was found at source and runtime of generating this SBOM. So already, instead of having a lawyer, having a one person, this be their problem where they comb through, they find the path, they write that down, they track it for N number of versions, you have a kind of stateless, repeatable, not stateless, as long as you have the source, but kind of a repeatable process of getting those licenses out. The next part is that we started finding, if a lot of you are familiar with kind of license compliance, that's awesome. But for those of you that are not, there's this thing called an SPDX license ID. It's kind of the official canonical. If you have a license in your software, including this ID is just as good as including the source file itself of what the license is, right? You're declaring this file, this capital M, capital I, capital T, is exactly licensed under this ID. And machines can recognize and just say, oh, stat, I found that. Then I don't have to skip anywhere. I don't have to find the license file. This was in some package metadata. Therefore, I can identify this to the website, to all of the linkage of updates to MIT or Apache or GPL, and kind of the entire license history that goes back to the development of those over time. And finally, one of the things that we found challenging when manually building the sheet is if you need to actually go into the packages, and then for every time you're going into a package and identifying what a license is, you can find these complex expressions where it says MIT or GPL or MIT or Apache, or just pick your poison, GPL 1.0 or GPL 2.0. And that one doesn't make sense, but they do exist. There's lots of incompatible statements that just exist because developers also themselves are unsure of what to include here. And so what that eventually means is that by generating this document, instead of people taking the time to discover where that is and interpret the statement, they can select one of those, and that can be the de facto selection here on going forward. Okay, so then you go from the manual challenges to, okay, now I'm a solution provider. I know I have SBOMs, but I want to build this bespoke, specialized tooling that only is internal to my organization. And that's hard because what we found is when we were building that bespoke thing, it was only good for certain images. We hard-coded logic that was only good for our application requirement changes. And we weren't still on the solution of using SBOMs yet, right? We were just trying to say, here's the SBOM for our application that we're releasing. Sometimes it has good license data, sometimes it doesn't. Let's just write a tool for this application specifically. But scaling that is hard because, as we talked about in the microservice example, if you're building something bespoke for Python, for Go, for NPM, for RPM, right? The N number of ecosystems is N number of logic and things you have to go through. So we kind of double back and we said, oh, well, we've already done this kind of packaging, this kind of package logic for SIFT, where we are cataloging the individual things. The license is normally right next to it. Let's key off of that. And instead of using the number of bespoke license processes for each different repo, we just aggregate them into one spot and say, we're going to use this kind of center SBOM workflow to recognize the licenses. This saved a lot of switching contexts because what we found is as people were jumping between different repos, they would have totally different senses of how the license kind of compliance work differed between one to the other. Once you put all of them in one basket, you could then think about, how do we make this generic enough that all of them can work together at this one point of kind of closure. So once we've moved to this generalized SBOM path, you can see the question mark is we need something that we don't want SIFT to then just become all about licenses, right? In the spirit of kind of a small Linux tooling, we don't want to lump this huge context on top of the SBOM generator. So we want someone who can run SIFT, pipe, SBOM to something that has the context. And that's where we get Grant. So you can follow along on the link that is Anchor Grant and kind of see what it can do as its own little program to start, which is listing them out. You get the nice little TUI view here, or you can output it as JSON, which has all of the actual data points of the license itself and the expression that goes along with it, linked to the packages that it was associated with, as well as the files that were used to identify proof of where that license existed. Okay, so now we're going to go through a quick solution that talks about how we combine all these tools together for the best results. And again, I want to emphasize that Grant pipe to spreadsheet, that is the use case that we found. But because Grant comes out with, again, the CSV or JSON data, don't think of the spreadsheet as the be all end all. Think of it as like kind of where you can pipe this data into whatever form you need, for your compliance or for your kind of data tracking needs. So this is the license report workflow that I linked second. It's kind of a personal repository. And what I did was I thought of myself as, okay, I am a consumer of I'm a consumer of software, and I want to make sure that for the 3 images in this repo, we are not changing the licenses over time. If something comes in there, it gets reviewed by my lawyers or someone who is the actual compliance, like kind of Caesar of thumbs up, thumbs down. This can go in, this cannot. And it's for 3 specific images. It's important to note that Grant can also recognize and analyze your software itself. So you can provide a path or you can provide a set of folders as well to it. But images are just kind of the bread and butter of how people are building software right now. So I thought it was the easiest for this example. So what we have is we have the images get published, and then you can either write a waiter that just sits and checks for new tags, or you can see in your Slack workflows that an image has been published. You can say, oh, I want to go click the button and kick off the license action, right? It is a workflow dispatch. Each image in like a matrix generates the SBOM per image. We pipe that to Grant, which generates the report. That report shows packages, links to licenses, kind of the what Dan alluded to 10 minutes ago. That whole spreadsheet gets generated rather than each person going through each line of the image itself and finding where the licenses exist for it. And then we aggregate that as a per sheet of a spreadsheet. So a new table gets created. If you go into the workflow, it's totally open source and public, so you can just click in the actions and see the workflow itself. The licenses are for Debian, for Alpine, and we used our friends over at ChainGuard, their Wolfie image, just to see how it matched up with like kind of the APKO like building process. And then you can see the different steps that we go through here. So this is the generate SBOM image, and not to belabor the point, but this workflow is like a 40-line workflow. So it's very quick to have set up, and then no one ever has to touch it again. And it's a matrix, so you can keep stacking images or sources into the array, so it just repeats it. So you think of that architecture diagram that we did before. This portion, this 3-portion part here where it says grant license report, that can kind of grow to n number. And then you can zip it into, again, spreadsheet is a primitive data type, but you could send it to a database. You could send that to a report format that someone clicks in Slack. Kind of use your imagination of what the output is that you can go to there. One thing that we wanted to kind of get away from, One thing we wanted to kind of get away from in the output is when you're generating this license report, we wanted Grant to have 2 modes. So we wanted it to have like an information finding session where it can just go, here's packages, here's licenses, thumbs up, send it off to the person who can then say yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down on the licenses. But we also made Grant smart enough with a check command that's not illustrated in this example that you can kind of take that step away from the compliance portion of your organization if you're confident enough to write a policy that says, I know for all components of this image, I never want to see GPL, no matter what. Hard line, no. Highlight all the things with GPL for me, and I will go through and kind of, thumbs up, thumbs down, and review if we can keep it, if we're linking against that software or not. So there is a policy portion, not as much as just a reporting of this is the state of the world. If you go and you see this like kind of single dispatch, you can see over time that you can click this any number of times for how you set the workflow. And what that kind of means is as you add images and as your complexity grows, your complexity of running this is no longer, oh, I just have a new ecosystem, so now I have to write a whole new thing for Python, or I have to write a whole new thing for NPM. No, because we base this off of the SIFT SBOM input that goes into Grant, your complexity never grows beyond clicking the run workflow of the new image that got put in. You just see the new sheet get added. So what happens is you start here with the compliance report. It has nothing at the bottom. You just see sheet 2. And then as the image analysis happens, you see Alpine latest. You see then the chain guard image get added. And finally, because Debian's the largest, you see the report for it get added. We are looking for feedback on the tool as well, because as you can see here in the column D, that's the website column, sometimes we'll run into a license called like kebab or GPL no invariant. And we can't recognize or find some kind of website that shows, hey, this is exactly what this license is. We're just lifting that statement out of the package data and sending it over to you to say, okay, this is what we found, but SPDX is either incomplete or this doesn't exist as an open source license. So it is a way to highlight, hey, this might be a closed source or custom license that some vendor or some person that you're consuming is hoisting over for you to deal with. So that's kind of the be all end all for Grant and the workflow and what the solution is that it provides. We do have a session here where we can talk about, after you're done using our open source tools, what does it look like to move over to Anchor Enterprise and how Enterprise can solve for that. And for that portion, I'm going to kick it back to Dan, who's going to take a stab at showing, like, if you enjoy using our open source tools, which I hope you do, then what is the next big step? Like, what is the next thing that we can do for you here at Anchor? So Dan, it's for you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. So hopefully that was a great primer for what you can do with Grant, right? And it's an extremely powerful tool, like our other open source tools. SIFT is that Chris has mentioned a lot as our SBOM generator. You can point it at various pieces of software, from source code repos to folders to container images, etc., and get a very detailed software bill of materials that doesn't just have like package names and versions. It's got all of this other metadata, files, relationships between things, license information, upstream data sources. A lot of information is inside what we call an SBOM. And then we have this ability to take those SBOMs and say, now you have one, you can pipe it over to a tool like Grape, which is our vulnerability scanner. It'll come in and generate right now vulnerability assessment of the material in your SBOM. You can pipe it over to Grant after setting up rules, like, this is the licenses I find acceptable. These are the ones I want to flag. These are the ones that I've explicitly allowed, things like that, and get a fully fleshed report to solve this specific problem that we've been talking about. There's a lot of power in that pipeline. And that's all of our sort of open source tooling surrounding all of that. Now, that is a very powerful set of tools. If you've got a project, a few projects, you're a developer that wants to be able to add some of these additional pieces of metadata that sit alongside the software that you're developing and releasing. But now we also have scenarios, especially with like larger organizations, where you might have tens of thousands of projects. You might have that many projects, and then each project has dozens of applications inside of them. Sometimes those applications update very frequently. Maybe they're internal applications, and you have a new build every day that's a candidate for pushing into production automatically, trying to achieve like actual continuous integration, right? So I mean, this problem can really start to scale out, and even though these tools allow you to generate these types of reports, orchestrating all of that automation can itself be a time-consuming effort. And so that's where our products kind of come in. Anchor Enterprise is the main product of the company Anchor. And what it does for organizations is you install it alongside your software development infrastructure and point it at essentially your material, whether it's your GitHub repositories or GitLab repositories, your container registries that have all of the images being pushed to them as an output of your CI/CD. You can point it at Kubernetes and it'll see what's running in terms of containers that are actually running in production, and then orchestrate generation of SBOMs for everything in your environment. It'll orchestrate the execution of vulnerability scans. It's got a policy engine in it where you can start to combine different policies. These are the things about security that I care about. These are the things about open source license compliance that I care about. These are the best practices that our development shops need to comply with that I care about, and apply those policies across all of your software assets as they're being pushed through CI, on an ongoing basis. It also has some other functions like the ability to report global status, right? Some of our customers have literally 30 to 40,000 new builds of certain container images across their entire organization every single day, right? And so generating reports once a week to say, like, here's what happened this week, boom, all of this information, it can kind of roll it up and help you manage this. And it's also a lot of data. So Anchor Enterprise also allows people to sort of, and organizations to manage the window of data as these things move forward, so it doesn't just grow infinitely and become unmanageable. One of the really interesting things about Anchor Enterprise is that this third item here, open source centric, right? We definitely have a lot of functionality across our tools. So inspect open source libraries and open source software that's part of your environment. But the application, the product itself is open source centric, and that inside of it, to perform these really valuable functions are tools like Sift and Gripe, and in the future, Grant. Anchor Enterprise right now does have capabilities to assess open source license compliance inside of our policy engines, as we're extracting some of that information from the SBOMs, but that are generated by Sift. But as to Chris's point earlier, this stuff can get really complicated. And so now we've got a more sort of high fidelity and a more nuanced way of inspecting and managing licenses, license information specifically. And like our other open source technologies, we're going to be moving Grant up into our product as well, which is a really interesting motion that we have here at Anchor to make sure that we have a very powerful open source tool. And if you interact with it, we'll see that power move forward into our products that hopefully you can find interesting to apply across your entire organization to manage all of this material and orchestrate all of this data generation. And so I think with that, we're kind of towards the sort of tail end of our presentation today. We've got a number of next steps for folks who are interested in this topic. Getting started with Grant, contributing to Grant. We've got some links up here. I definitely wanted to call out, we have an open public community that's very vibrant. It's where people talk to our open source developers about the tools, to have live high bandwidth discussions about things moving forward. And this is in addition to our GitHub pages where we've got lots of material there to interact with the developers. We have an ongoing community meeting. Everyone's invited to come and have an even higher bandwidth discussion with open source developers directly. And of course, we've got our products and services hosted at anchor.com and the platform link.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, you two. Okay, a couple of questions that we wanted to tackle. Is there a roadmap for Grant, and what does it look like?
Sorry. Sometimes unmuting the microphone is extremely hard. Yes, there is a roadmap for Grant. You can go to the Grant repo, and there's a couple of issues that have already been filed. The one thing that I want to kind of bring to everyone's attention is the next feature that should be going out with the release of, I think we're going to be on 0.3, will be the ability to subtract or take a diff from an image and another report. So what that means is that basically, like, if you analyze the base image of what you're putting in and you say, my software does not link at all against this image, then you can subtract the licenses found there from an analysis that's done just on your source repo and just on kind of the licenses that go into the binary or to the software that's going in. So that diff analysis will be able to shorten some of the workload on the compliance side of what do you actually care about. And then after that, we'll look to do like kind of you can either do a stateless report or you can have state going forward that maintains them over time. But thanks for joining the call. You can join the grant repo and post an issue and direct the roadmap if you find something else. Those are just the two best ideas that we have going forward. But if there's something that you really need, be loud about it, post an issue, and we will make sure to get that into a next release, because that's kind of what our development motion is all about here at Anchor.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And then another thing popped up. Why spreadsheets? Why are we not just doing SBOMs, handing that over to teams? What's the difference?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Yeah, I mean, Dan's dealt with the complexity of this before for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll take this, but definitely interested in your take too, Chris. On this one, I think, something Chris just mentioned is one angle. Like an SBOM will have a list or maybe a license or an expression, but it really doesn't capture some of the nuance of what's actually needed at the end of the day, right? I've gone through this myself many times. I actually looked, in one of our Google Drives, just sort of anecdotally, I found 40 spreadsheets that enumerated open source licenses. And I kind of went and looked at for various versions of our products over the years. I went and looked at them and tried to remember, because I generated some of them myself, and tried to remember, like, how did we get there? And it wasn't just look at an SBOM, write down what it said. Part of the reason is that they're, the names of licenses are kind of, not always the same. There's expressions like this or this or this. There's incompatible things, this, GPL1 and GPL2. You have to figure that stuff out. And Grant is the place where we can actually try to figure this stuff out and try to get it to the point where it lands in the spreadsheet with enough fidelity and accuracy, such that when you hand it over to the person who's asking the question, there isn't a follow-up, right? Which is always the intention. The other thing that I think just a spreadsheet that just shows exactly what's in the SBOM doesn't really help you manage known incompatibilities, right? Grant is a place where you can actually say, I know, right, that my base image, which is like, say, Fedora or Red Hat or something like that, has a bunch of software in it that's GPL, but it's in the base image, right? There are triggers that don't matter. If it were something that were directly a dependency of my application, that would be the thing that the person asking cares about. But it just happens to be there because we're publishing it as container image. There are other things you need to do when you do that, but it falls into a different category of it's in there, and it's the same as a direct dependency that's really vital to the operation of the application. So those nuances are things where you can start to encode, this why this GPL is different from this GPL through assessment and policy actuation. Right. So I think those are probably the two most prominent ones. The other is a little lighter, but it has to do with the fact that while infrequent, project licenses change over time. And being able to catch that and explicitly say, not necessarily, these are the licenses I care about and these are the ones I don't, but to detect a change of any kind in an open source dependency of your application is really important. And for that, you need something with logic, right? It's not just data. Those are that's kind of my thinking on why this is such an important piece of the infrastructure.
Awesome. And then we just had another question in the chat, actually. Can I use grant on SBOMs generated by a tool that is not SIFT? Or in other words, if my supplier supplies me an SBOM, can I run grant on it? Are there prerequisites for this to work? And Chris already put some in the chat, but maybe you want to chat about it as well live?
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to make sure some thoughts were down in the chat in case we ran out of time. But Roland, you can submit SPDX and CycloneDX documents into grant. Some of the experiments we're running right now, since it's pre 1.0, is where are the gaps in the analysis? Because we even see with SBOMs that are generated by SIFT, SPDX provides higher fidelity with regards to licenses than CycloneDX does. And that's just because I think SPDX has a better data format as far as how it's expressing license expressions and being able to break them down. Whereas when we get to some of the decoding or the encoding on the CycloneDX side, there are some gaps where maybe the license itself doesn't exist, or we have a complex expression that can't be shown as multiple licenses on CycloneDX. So CycloneDX has a very like one-to-one. It is this license, and then there's another thing where it could be 1-to statement, where it's this license statement. And so it's sometimes on the SBOM generator, it's on the tool that's generating the SBOM to aggregate all the licenses together and build a complex SPDX statement, even if the maintainer of the project you're analyzing hasn't given that to you yet. So whereas SPDX, you could reflect that as multiple licenses and just hand that over to the SBOM. CycloneDX is a bit more strict and puts an onus of work on the generator, which we're trying to hammer out the details for SIFT, but that is that's a high bar to clear when you're not even sure when the license that's given to you, if it's a official SPDX license, like from the license list, or if it's just some random junk license that's been thrown in there that was made up by the company of the software that you're consuming. What I'm going to do too is I'm going to link the SPDX license list in chat, because if you take anything from here, even if it's not using grant, you should check out this license list, because this is the official canonical, how you talk about open source licenses and what IDs and what metadata it links to when you're consuming things out in the wild for your software. So this is kind of the base data that grant pulls from and bakes into its analysis when it's looking for these IDs or looking for kind of hints and or proof that these IDs may or may not have existed at some point in the metadata of the package that you're analyzing. So good question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think that is wrapping up our Q&A today. So thank you very much, both of you, for the wonderful, insightful webinar. We have a bunch of next steps, as we already talked about. Please do join us on the GitHub and our community Slack, right, to keep in touch and follow along. It'd be awesome to have some contributors to the product, and I'm always happy to see more community members involved. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you soon online. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.